Hello and welcome. We've already focused on developing a risk mindset and also examined the concept of working with risk. Now I'm going to suggest to you that it's time to turn more of our attention towards who we're actually involving in this challenge of working with risk in order to achieve, let's say, clear and particularly confident risk decisions. In order to do this, it will require us to examine how we work with individuals and also how we work in teams in order to achieve decisions that will help us to shape our potential for action that comes out of our risk-taking decisions. Let's start by thinking about values. Our values influence everything we think, everything we decide, everything we do. This is going to include an influence over how we work with other people, including our considerations regarding risk and risk taking, and how we work with other people in order to achieve clear and confident decisions. So, whether you're the lone wolf, you like working in isolation, or perhaps you're part of a group of people that you work with, perhaps you feel more satisfied running with the herd. I'd have to say the lone wolf option does have some appeal to me, some attraction. Certainly, if I think in terms of the role of self employment that I've been involved in since October 2001. Whereas that idea of going with the herd can sometimes be more about safety in numbers. And I'd have to say, personally, I've always been comfortable about not necessarily having that safety of numbers, rather stepping out there, putting some ideas out there. And I like to think that this whole positive risk taking course is, to a degree, a result of that kind of way of thinking, that kind of way of working. But then perhaps you're one of those people who are more nuanced regarding your collaborations, influenced more by the creative needs of the situation. Again, I'm going to make my own claim that this ultimately is my preferred way of working, that seeking out creative collaborations in relation to specific areas of the work. If I think about my practice development and my review projects, it's seeking out particular people that I collaborate with in order to do those. That, I'd say, is my more favoured way of working, though the element of that lone wolf side also has really supported me to focus on what I want to do, get my work out there. But it is those collaborations with particular people, depending on what the needs are, what the circumstances are, and indeed what the risk-taking decision might be, that those collaborations are also very important. Well, your working relationship will develop and will have an impact on how you or how comfortable you feel taking risks in particular circumstances, and that will be influenced by your relationship to these two major ideas on this slide. I'll be coming back again to this idea of collective decision making. Your working relationships will also determine how comfortable you feel working with others in general or specifically, and this will ultimately be influenced by your values. That level of comfort working with other people is something that's a combination of influences and experiences. Influences, experiences that you've stored up pretty much over a whole lifetime. Having said that, let's also think in terms of an underlying principle that would be relevant to this idea of working with others. In the United Kingdom, the Department of Health set out a whole series of principles back in 2007. It's a publication which I still think is available online. It was entitled Best Practice in Managing Risk. And yes, I was involved in some of the discussions informing its development, and some of my risk tools are included in their recognised series of tools that they say have been designed to meet these working principles. One of the core principles states what you see on this slide, that risk management should be conducted in a spirit of collaboration and based on a relationship between the service user and their carers that is as trusting as possible. This is focusing very much in on that need to develop collaborative working relationships with the individuals who are in need, those people who need the service, but also with those who are closest to them, the people that provide or offer most of their care and support, perhaps. The challenge for many practitioners, though, in this situation or this type of working relationship is to openly discuss issues of risk, inquire into historical incidents or events, and explore the potential for repeat patterns in those behaviours or those activities. But this can be a very delicate balance. You're often feeling for the earliest opportunity in the relationship to try and make a start on what are very sensitive discussions. It'll be important to phrase these in terms of the positive benefits to the individual of exploring what will often be seen by them more usually as very negative events. An organisation in the UK called In Control focused a lot around the idea of personalisation, person-centred working. They reflect on this area as far as working with risk and taking risks is concerned. They identify and deliver what they call truly person-centred practice. And their view is that this is a process known as personalisation that can help people to be safer. And they suggest this because it will focus on abilities and strengths in a way that helps us to achieve a whole person-centred way of developing a risk assessment, as opposed to the idea of just focusing on, dare I say, a service-centred box-ticking bureaucracy. The In Control organisation argue that a more robust risk management system can emerge from this type of approach. And I'm going to discuss it and focus in on it in much more detail. I'll give the strengths idea more attention in Module 4, which conveniently is entitled Working with Strengths. And that will come very much from the same value base as what In Control as an organisation are also trying to put across. So let's move from values through a principle to philosophical conflict. However you're working with risk, however you go about it, and particularly however you go about developing it with other people, it's always going to present some kind of philosophical conflict. When you're put in a position of trying to balance the needs of the individual with the safety and the protection of others, whether that's close relatives of a person, whether that was people working with that individual, or indeed rarely but occasionally thinking in terms of protection and safety of the general public, it's important to recognise that the types of risks that generate these conflicts are rare events. And that's a message that I hope comes through quite strongly throughout the whole of the positive risk-taking course. Nonetheless, we must recognise the needs of the individual in rare circumstances will not sit easily with either the real or, more often perhaps, the perceived fears of the public. This idea of public protection will particularly emerge where they've been presented with media reports, whether they're distorted or otherwise, of the kind of harm that could randomly happen to anybody. We have procedural arrangements depending on what kind of business you're working in. For example, in health, social care, whatever your role is, there are procedural arrangements. Examples from health and social care would be the interpretations of the Mental Capacity Act or of safeguarding responsibilities. These kinds of arrangements can often impact on individual liberties. And while many practitioners will recognise the benefit of supporting service users to learn, particularly through taking risks, well, they may often feel an overwhelming pressure to avoid making errors, with this becoming their main priority. Again, it's something addressed in other parts of the course. We've become more concerned with stopping things going wrong than we do trying to do the right thing or move things forward or take the risk. That fear of criticism and blame leads us to an all too frequent but maybe understandable retreat into defensive practice. But we should also be more explicit about the risks of defensive practice. Again, I need to remind you here, a risk-averse decision is a good one if it's carefully thought through, but not if it's only there through fear and blame. So the risks of defensive practice might be, for example, the failure to really effectively involve and empower people in the whole conversation around their risk taking. Ultimately, I would say that was a failure in working with people. We run the risk of the blame culture, this blame game completely undermining efforts to work collaboratively with others. We're left in a position perhaps seeking to protect ourselves in some kind of cloud of negative castigations on others. And here's the image that sums it up. It was his fault. It was her fault. It was their fault. But it was not me. Always trying to deflect that notion of blame, the concerns for the blame culture. Having said that, people who use services need to be involved in decisions that affect their daily lives, including decisions about risk taking. I'd have to say it's widely reported, if you look into the risk literature, the commentary from service users themselves, it's failure that will feature quite powerfully in those conversations. The kind of conversations that people have when they're reflecting on their use of services or their experiences of risk. In particular, they'll come up with things such as the fear of losing their own independence, a fear of losing their value, or even their place in society, and a failure to incorporate a rights-based approach, particularly when thinking about risk, will quickly result in people being perceived as sources of risk first and potentially at risk second. And I'm going to suggest to you that the balance set out in that way would be the wrong way around. So there are questions like, should positive risk taking be seen as a basic personal right for each individual? And when you're pondering that question, keep in mind that most of us do actually enjoy a right to make personal choices, personal decisions. And when we're thinking about these challenging rights and responsibilities, we should really think about the healthy attributes of collaborative risk decision making, not just thinking in terms of positive risk taking as being negligent, high stakes gambling. Most of all, we've really got to engage people to articulate what their experiences are, what their perceptions of risk are. Because if we look at the inquiry reports and the research that emerges around risk, then the reality is that people, certainly in health and social care, are victims far more than they are perpetrators of risk. Though you wouldn't know that by reading the research and reflecting on the literature very quickly. The challenge here is one of thinking about how we achieve something that is more empowering. If we adopt more of a rights-based approach with people, it is likely to be experienced by the majority as a more empowering process. And this could be characterized in a number of ways, as shown here on this particular slide. First of all, it's always important to remember information is power, so share it. And that works in all aspects of our lives, not just in terms of risk. And sharing implies working with people. An empowering process comes out of empathic understanding of the personal experiences and perceptions of risk held by others. Not jumping into a professional assessment of, let's say, it's my role to assess you, this is what your risk is. No, it should be about engaging and empathically connecting with the experiences that have been articulated by that other person in a collaborative discussion, particularly trying to get people to talk through risk in terms of past events, past experiences, and how they may play out in the future. Are we seeing repeated patterns? How the past, the present, and the future might link in certain circumstances with certain risk factors. These are delicate discussions. This collaborative discussion is about jointly identifying early warning signs. So if we're thinking about taking risks, have we really held that conversation about anticipating what could go wrong? How we'd identify that together, negotiating, again, bargaining, but keeping that bargain very much focused on the individual, the person themselves, using person-centered as the main focus of the language here. There's certainly an argument to say that we should be focused on relationship-centered working, that this is something that is perhaps a better reflection of reality. It's not trying to set the person up in isolation, an island on their own. In reality, working with people is about relationships and working together within those relationships. Importantly, the last point here, this idea of helping people to express their choices and to receive flexible support around those choices, being responsive, being open with people to mutual learning, being open with people to mutual learning as part of this working relationship, as part of these collaborative discussions. So in summary, empowering people really involves good discussion, being aware of choices, listening to priorities, supporting people to make decisions. This image reminds us that we all need a helping hand occasionally, particularly if we're going to achieve those very challenging, difficult goals. Working with people is always going to be better. If you're somebody who is the lone wolf and wants to work alone, there's always the danger that challenging decisions taken alone can look like this. You end up the woman wide awake at 3 o'clock in the morning because you're constantly pondering over in your mind that particular decision, the challenges of that decision, dare I say, the consequences of that decision. Take some time to reflect on the messages in this video presentation and ask yourself, are you more of a lone wolf, or do you prefer running with a herd? Are you one of the leaders within that herd, or are you honestly happy just to go along for the ride? Comfortable in the notion of what the majority are thinking.